Our daughter Zoe and her husband Travis and their 2 children, our grandchildren, live in Australia. They're farmers, a couple of hours south of Perth. And until a few months ago, they were living in an off-grid house with a few hundred acres of land that they leased. Rainwater would be collected in huge storage tanks for all the domestic needs, including for their bed and breakfast guests that they hosted. The combination of people having showers, using the loos, washing laundry, drinking and cooking, plus providing water for the dogs and however many hens they had at the time, and having to water parts of the garden sometimes, meant that occasionally the water tanks ran dry. What a pain. It meant ordering a tanker load of water for delivery at a cost of $550 or just over £300. So the water would be ordered, they'd meet the driver by the road a mile away. They'd try to persuade the driver that the steep, twisty driveway, rutted deeply in dry weather, as we found out, was manageable with a huge tanker, and he'd drive up cautiously. Or he'd refuse and they'd have to lead him round a longer way through the back entrance to the land. But one way or another, he'd make it. The tanks would be refilled with clean, fresh water. It came at a cost, around 42p a litre it works out at, but it was available just by making a phone call. Water is precious, isn't it? Water is life-giving. How much water do you use? The average British person uses over 140 litres of water at home every day. And I'm going to be pretty smug here and tell you that Steve and I use half that. And I don't think we smell too bad. But we are consciously very careful. So the past month, when there was virtually no rain, we put our washing up water and even bath water, I treated myself once or twice, on the garden. We're careful what chemicals, what washing agents we use so that that's safe. And it goes back for me to being about 9 or 10 in school, and we just moved to a new school. It had sinks in the classroom, and the head teacher came in, Mr. Williams, to warn us that just because we'd got, water in the sink on tap, literally, we had to be careful with it. It was precious. And there was a bit of a drought going on at the time as well, and we had a lesson on how to save water when we were brushing our teeth. And being slightly autistic, it stuck with me. And it gave me the beginning of a great respect for how precious water is and how carelessly sometimes we use it. Because, it is. It's precious. It's life-giving. After a year when our economy's been hit hard, and perhaps we're wondering where money's going to come from to meet our national responsibilities, it's a good time for all of us to reassess what we do with our personal money. Between us, just in the UK, we spend 2.3 billion a year just heating water for our showers. We flush about 740 billion litres down the loo every year. And all that water has been previously stored and cleaned and treated, and will again be stored and cleaned and treated before it goes back into open water. I don't know if any of you saw a recent BBC documentary called The Secret Science of Sewage. If not, it's still available online. It's worth watching. It's not as gruesome as it sounds. It's really interesting, and it showed where in Birmingham, on a huge plant, wastewater is being treated and repurposed for fuel, as agricultural soil conditioner, and even potentially for new medicines. It's being treated as precious. Water is precious. It's our life. Let me tell you about another of our daughters. She's not my birth child, but she's my Ugandan daughter, Dora. Steve and I met Dora when we all worked for the Iona community on the Isle of Iona in 2016. Her mum is a teacher in a school for children with physical disabilities in Uganda, and Dora and her brother had lived and grown up there and gone to school there before Dora then won a scholarship to a residential secondary school and then was sponsored by a British couple to go to university. Her first visit a few years before we met her to the UK had been a huge cultural shock for Dora. She'd been amazed to learn that every house has its own flushing loo. On a pedestal, with a seat, perhaps with rails to help people who were a bit less physically able. It was a world away from what she'd grown up with, drop latrines in a school where lots of children had to crawl to use them. So they were a hazard. In UK, she watched people go to the loo and then, calm as you like, flush away litres of clean, fresh water, drinkable water, time after time. She taught us a lot more about precious water, life-giving water. So, as you've heard, it's the beginning of Christian Aid Week, and their theme this year is Every Drop Counts. Every last drop. The charity marks its 70th anniversary this year, and for some time they've been at the forefront with others, campaigning for environmental justice, because they're witnessing the increasing negative impact of unreliable weather patterns and rising sea levels on their overseas partners' lives and livelihoods. And of course, the irony is that those countries worst affected cause least climate damage themselves. So Christian Aid works with others to improve lives of the poorest and most vulnerable, as well as being a voice and advocate for them. Let me share a couple of stories they've shared of two of our sisters in Kenya. Rose is a 68-year-old grandmother who remembers a hunger-free childhood, when rains came regularly and crops grew. It's different now when she's bringing up grandchildren. They often all go hungry. The weather goes from months of drought to flooding, and crops shrivel or are washed away. Most of the year, she spends the majority of every day walking long distances to collect enough fresh water. Florence, on the other hand, also lives in Kenya. She's widowed and a mother, but she and her children don't go hungry. She's fortunate to live just a short walk away from a new village dam built with support of donations from Christian Aid. So she grows tomatoes, onions, chilies. She keeps bees and sells the honey. Two women in the same country living very different lives, simply depending on whether they're near fresh, clean water. This stuff, precious water, life-giving water. So let's move to the God bit. And we start at the beginning. The very first element in the biblical 7-stage drama of creation is water. Before seas and land, before any living plant or creature, there's water. Water that's put in its rightful place by God, ready to be useful. In this story, God creates people last, in God's own image, to rule over the other creatures, all the while accountable to God. But it's not far into the narrative, is it, before people are resisting God's supremacy, wanting not only to be made in God's image, but actually God's themselves, God's ourselves. Before long, people like us fail to acknowledge their humanity and their accountability. Soon, they're pitting themselves against each other, and people rule over other people. So the stories unfold, one by one, often against a backdrop that can be hard. The dream is of a new Eden, a new paradise, a place of soft rains and lush growth of vines and figs and wheat and barley and olives and pomegranates, with rich pastures for the bees to collect, for the cattle to eat, a land flowing with milk and honey. But the reality is often wilderness. And the early stories are of nomadic wanderings, always on the lookout for water, precious water, life-giving water. And yet, in the stories, even the wilderness occasionally knows epic flooding. And Egypt, on the Nile floodplain, occasionally suffers drought. We read of water struck from rocks or that fills dry waddies overnight. There's water too bitter to drink and good water given in welcome to strangers arriving in camp. Water cleanses to make fit the people of God to be in God's presence. Water heals even the foreigner, even the madman. And just as in baptism, water is the sign of life in God, a new beginning with God. There are encounters besides ancient wells. Jesus calls disciples from their life on the water. He tells parables of God's kingdom at hand from a boat and on a hillside by a freshwater lake. And he meets disciples on the beach, their nets full with promise of abundance. And in John's vision, right at the end of the biblical stories, John's vision of the new heaven and the new earth, the thirsty are refreshed from the spring of the water of life, while the river of the water of life runs from the very throne of God and the Lamb right through the centre of the street. A new Eden, where no one will ever be thirsty again, where no one will ever need to worry about having water, life-giving water. And as the stories unfold, they're punctuated with calls for a return to obedience to God. punctuated with demands for God's justice to be done. We see kings lust after wealth and power, and we hear prophets pleading for God's poor and vulnerable and threatening divine retribution. We read of acts of great kindness and of sagas of great violence. And by contrast to that violence is always the mercy of God, the kindness of God. We see Nineveh saved from the promise of destruction. We read of devoted kindness between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law. We see the at-risk hidden by strangers at risk to themselves. We read of the hungry sharing their last food. We see the criminal offered eternal sanctuary. We read again and again of pivotal acts of mercy that redirected history and have led to this moment and brought us here. We learn of Sabbath, time to pause. We read of Jubilee, time to redress. We still need some kind of Sabbath, a regular time of pause to slow down, to set aside our egos and bring our steps firmly back on God's path. We need Sabbath to remember that we are created in God's image, creations of the supreme God, God's creatures. We must remember that we are dependents. We depend on God, and we depend on water. Precious, life-giving water, the symbol of God's life. We're not creators. We're not the owners of this precious stuff. We're not its controllers. We are its God-appointed stewards, and every drop counts. We must remember Sabbath. We must pause. We must keep on learning to walk humbly, listening alongside God. And having listened to God, we must live out God's kingdom come. Ours must be lives that redress the balance of life for God's earth and for God's poor and vulnerable. Ours must be the voices that demand economic and environmental justice of governments, of corporations, of the courts, for each of our sisters and brothers. As God's prophets, we must insist on keeping on speaking truth to power. God's truth to power. And as God's priests, we must offer holy kindness, mercy. We must share hopes and dreams in our stories. We must share our resources, our wealth, our technology and engineering, our seeds and our markets, our food and medicines. We must make it possible for Rose and her grandchildren to have their fair share of this.